just finishing some finishing details on this giant bib I'm creating. It was a stenciled project. I'm adding some ink detail line work to just make it a little more attractive. Stenciling is a great love of mine. It's been going on in my life for several years, but it's been going on in the history of our country for a lot of years. It began with the itinerant stenciler. He began stenciling by traveling from home to home, staying there to earn his board and keep, and traveling on to the next person. The same thing's happening today, but it's the custom stenciler who's doing it. And we're going to show you a lot of techniques that she can use. These are the different kinds of stencils that I mentioned earlier. There are different kinds of materials that are available for stencils. There are pre-cut stencils. This is a basic stencil. You can see that there are bridges, which are the connecting points between the open areas of your stencil. This is made out of a plastic material. We have the same type of stencil cut out of a thinner grade material. This one happens to be, you can see that there are bridges between the different areas, but it is made out of a 5mm Mylar. This is also a basic stencil. Then we also have brass stencils. These, of course, are very durable. They're not as pliable, so oftentimes if you're using them and trying to curve around a rounded object, you obviously cannot do that as readily. This would be the feeling that you get. Whereas with the more pliable, bendable stencils, you can go all the way around a curved object. These are used oftentimes in embossing and doing different kinds of art forms with paper products. Then we have a little bit more of a sophisticated, we'll call it for lack of a better term. This is a stencil that has 3 separate parts. All of them put together forms a finished banner, as you can see in this particular case. This is what we refer to as a theorem stencil. It's a very simplified theorem stencil. There are other kinds of theorems that have a great deal more detail and many overlays. There can probably be as many as 25 overlays in some stencils. But what we're going to work with in this video are going to be a more simplified kind of stenciling so that it can make you, the amateur, the beginner, the one who wants to know how to stencil, become a professional with very little bit of effort. So first of all, we have talked about the stencils. These are the ones that are already pre-cut and ready for you to work with. There are also times when you may want to cut your own stencil. When you want to cut your own stencil, first of all, you have to have a material to cut it out of. You can get the 5mm Mylar. You can also get blank film from the, in this particular case, it's from Delta. It is the same plastic material that their other stencils are made out of, but it's provided for you so that you can cut your own stencil. There are many times when you want to match a wallpaper or you want to match a fabric, and you can't find just the right stencil to work with. So there are different ways in which you can cut a stencil. I have just very basically drawn up a couple of different stencil designs. You can see these are very simple to cut. The more intricate you get, a lot longer time is needed to cut your stencil. Not a hard task, it's just a task that needs to be done before you can stencil. When I cut stencils, what I would normally do is have a piece of glass, and this particular piece of glass has been sandblasted so the edges aren't sharp, and you want to protect yourself from possible cuts, and determine what you're going to cut. I've already drawn the heart shape on the 5mm Mylar, so that step is done, but I want to show you how simple it is to go ahead and prepare your stencil for cutting. This comes with 2 sheets of film, and what you need to do, you can see that it's translucent so that you can see the image through your Mylar or through your plastic film. When you cut a stencil, what you need to do is to be sure that you give yourself margin around the perimeter of your stencil so that you have protection when you're doing your actual stenciling. Oftentimes when you're working with a stencil brush, what you'll find that if you have only given yourself a little bit of a margin, you're liable to overshoot your protection. And what I'm going to do is just quickly, with a permanent marking pen, draw this on. This happens to be a brick, and we are going to show you how to brick a wall a little bit later, but I want to first cut the stencil so you'll have it to work with. 1 brick, 2 brick. Sometimes these little wobbly lines, when you actually start your cutting, you can correct a whole lot of sins. I'm going to cut the heart with the X-Acto knife. Both mediums cut just as well with the X-Acto knife. When you cut a stencil, you apply pressure and you just take little jerky, short cuts. And instead of turning your hand, what you're actually doing is turning the material you're cutting the stencil from. I want to be sure that, yep, it's cutting. Sometimes you can't tell whether it's really cutting through or not. And generally, I always press far too hard. But see, if you rotate the material, and in some areas you can drag your hand, trying to stay in the line you have provided yourself with. And then when you get down to this little point, it just takes a pivot. Don't lift the knife. If you lift the knife, you can't necessarily get it back in the right place, which would cause you to have to, or possibly tear your stencil when you're trying to extract that center portion. And when I work with stencils, and that's one of the things that we're going to be working with, is that I use all parts of the stencil. What I'm cutting out of the center is not necessarily scrap, it's treasure. And so you're going to keep that portion. And let's hope that all has come out. Whoops! Nope, it's coming. Sometimes you have to hold your mouth just right, but it will come out. So with one stroke of the knife, we have cut a heart. I'm going to show you another method, and this you don't have to apply quite so much pressure. This is an electric stencil cutter. There are several different ones on the market. This one just is a comfortable one to use. And the technique with this is that it melts the plastic film. So you can just slide that knife or that cutter right along the edge or on the line that you have drawn. In this case, I'm not necessarily going to pivot the material like I did the other one. I can lift it. I can reposition my cutting tool and see how I'm smoothing up those jagged lines I was drawing. And many times when you're doing any kind of artwork, you find that everything works better if you work towards yourself. There we are. The thing that you find with working with this kind of a tool is that there is a film that builds up. That melted plastic needs to be scraped away, and you can use your fingernail. The best thing to use is a credit card, and we all have those. Oftentimes I don't let it bother me, and I just go ahead and stencil because that ridge doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Now this is going to be another portion of our stencil that we're going to be using later. I'm going to go ahead and quickly cut it. You can see that this just melts right through the film. And you can also see this was a handmade brick. It's got funny little ins and outs and ups and downs and angles. Whoops. Sometimes those little unnecessary moves of our knife or cutting tool kind of help make it work a little better. Okay, so we have both bricks cut and we have a heart cut. We're going to use both of these later on. When you begin stenciling, there are a lot of things that you're going to need, but the most important thing that you'll probably need will be a stencil brush. The stencil brushes need to be comfortable to hold on to, and these particular brushes made by Delta are that. They are comfortable to hold on to. When you pick it up, it just kind of fits into your hand like this, so you can grasp it and do your stenciling technique. Stenciling is meant to be done at a perpendicular angle, so that if you're stenciling, you're working your brush perpendicular to the surface. These brushes do a tremendous good job. Another thing you're going to need is going to be your stencil paint cream. We're going to be working with the stencil paint cream. It is an oil-based product. There are other products that you can use. One of those is, of course, a liquid paint. The situation with the liquid paint is that it's a very wet form of paint, and in order to stencil without it bleeding under the edge of your stencil, you need to blot most of the moisture out of it. And let me just show you just a real quick demonstration of how that works. First of all, put your paint out on a palette. Have some paper towel handy, because you're going to have to blot the moisture out of that paint in order to have a certain degree of success in your stenciling. And I'm going to stencil just a real quick Christmas tree light. This is an address book. It's always a good idea to check to see if the wording is correct. You don't want to stencil it upside down and backwards. When you stencil with the liquid paint, touch the surface, pick up your color, then I kind of work it on the palette, so I work it into the fibers of my brush. Then go to the paper toweling and blot it so that there's very little moisture left, and in some cases you think that probably there's not much pigment left either. Now this particular stencil is a one-part stencil, and in order to use it, I'm going to use its dropout, or that treasure part that I mentioned earlier, to cover up the area that I don't want to work. So I go directly to my stencil and I work that color round and round the edge of the open area. Every time you stencil, whether it's with this liquid paint, the Ceram coat, or with any other kind of material, the more you work at the edge of the plastic, the stronger that color is going to be. Then as you work inward, you build an automatic highlight and an automatic shadow. You can see there that I've also left the tail end of my stencil undone. So what I'm going to do is make that a gray color. It could be gold. You could have gold Christmas tree lights, I guess. Touch to the surface, work it into the brush, then work the moisture out so that you're not going to chance it bleeding under the edge of your stencil. Now I'm positioning my treasure again, this dropout from the Christmas tree light, to protect the red portion of the light that's already been done. So voila, we've stenciled a Christmas tree light. Okay, we're going to talk and use predominantly in the video the stencil paint cream. This is an oil-based paint about the consistency of paste shoe polish, so that when you open the container, it's not going to spill. You're going to be able to work with it as you would an oil paint. You can blend, you can shade, you can mix colors, you can do all kinds of wonderful things. When you first open your stencil paint cream, you will find, and this has been a used one, you'll find that there's a film on the surface. You will take a piece of paper towel, and you can see I just tore a piece of paper towel off, and I'm just going to scrub that film off. Then we're going to use stencil adhesive. This is a product that I use predominantly when I'm stenciling on fabric. This is sprayed onto the cardboard that my fabric will lay over. This makes it tacky so that when I lay my fabric down, it's going to spread down and stick tight to it, so that when I stencil, there's not going to be any moving or shifting of the fabric. Set this over here. There are different ways that you can stencil. Oftentimes in stencils, particularly the kind, the daffodils that I showed you in the traditional kind of stencil. In order to keep the colors separate, you need to mask off areas. You can use masking tape. Another method that you can use, which is really, really slick, is to use Post-it notes. You can take the stencil and cover those areas real quickly that you don't want, say, the green of this particular leaf to get down in the brown of the bulb. Likewise, you can just move it around to keep the yellow out of the green area. You can use as many of these little notes as necessary. They stick on there and they do the job that's needed. So Post-it notes work great. The masking tape works great. You can also use note cards. These can be just laid down and stenciled around and moved as you need. You can tear them into different kinds of shapes to get into little crooks and crannies that you can't necessarily always work around. So all of these are things that you're going to find might need to go in your little bag of tricks. Keep these handy so that your stenciling becomes a lot of fun rather than a lot of labor. And what I have done is I've got a little bag of tricks here, and you can see that these have all been loved and treasured. These are just cutouts. When I've done different stenciling projects, you can oftentimes cut out that particular shape that you're working with, and would be the mask. You can use an angle bird. You've got inside curves, you've got outside curves, you've got points, you've got right angles. So all of these things can be used. You can see that I use my little bag of tricks a great deal of the time. There are other things that you can use, and we'll be talking about these in different parts of our video today. You can use labels. You can use different kinds of textures. Sandpaper oftentimes helps in holding fabric in place if you've got a tiny little place. These are disappearing marking pens. These are necessary sometimes when you're working with stencils that have more than one overlay. This would be the implement that you would use to mark your registration points on fabric. You can do it on walls also. That when you lay your second overlay, your third overlay, your fourth, however many there happen to be in your particular stencil, that you'll match it up with that little mark made. Let's see what else I have in my bag of tricks. Q-tips. Sometimes you can lick and rub a Q-tip. It'll take out a lot of those little boo-boos, and one of the things that's important in a stenciler's regimen is to know how to fix mistakes, because we all make mistakes. We also have a dab-on stencil adhesive. This is one that you use predominantly for applying an adhesive to the back side of your stencil. There is a foam end to this and a little ball, and you just press and apply. I don't know if you can, yeah, there you can see, I think. Can you see the little bits of adhesive that are coming out around the stencil? Now this goes on white, but when it dries it will be clear, and this is a press apply repositional adhesive. Good little tool to have. Oh, there are stars. There are all kinds of shapes in here, and I'm going to be using the star later, so let me, that one looks like it's been used and abused. Let me dig out one that's a little better. Okay, here's a star that we'll be using later. I'm going to keep it so that I can get my hands on it readily. Another important tool would be erasers. Erasers, particularly when you're working on a solid, hard surface, erasers are going to come in very handy. Sometimes you get smudges where you don't want smudges to be, and you can take that eraser and erase can't erase acrylic paint. See, that's a lesson that you have to learn. You can erase the liquid or the stencil paint cream, but you can't erase acrylic paint. Another reason why I think I might like to use the stencil paint cream. I can erase a lot of sins. Another little thing that you might want to stick in your bag of tricks would be a hole punch. This way you can punch holes and make your own berries. A couple of sizes of hole punches would give you a couple of sizes of berries. These are all the touches, the techniques, and the things that you're going to need in your bag of tricks. We're ready to get down to basics now. What I have done is prepared a surface to stencil over. What I did is I sprayed a cardboard surface with repositional adhesive. I mentioned earlier that I want that sticky so that my fabric is going to adhere to it, so there's not going to be any slipping and sliding. First of all, we're going to do just basic stenciling. I've chosen this String of Stars stencil by Delta. It's one of my favorites. You can see that it's a favorite. Our stencils are loved, and our stencils are reused and reused and reused. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to use a stencil many, many times. When you first work with the stencil paint cream, as I mentioned, you have to peel the film off the surface. I have done that with these particular colors. When you load the stencil brush, you just touch the brush to the surface of the paint and just lightly dance it. That picks up a tiny, tiny bit of paint on the end of your brush. Then you go to the stencil. Work the paint into the brush by just working it on the plastic of the stencil, and then go to the open area of the stencil. Working in a circular manner, work that color into the open area. Now with this particular stencil, we're not going to get so much of that shading technique. It can be achieved, but it's not a necessary thing. And you'll see that I keep going back to that initial test place in order to pick up color. When you run out of color, touch again to your stencil paint cream, work it on the plastic, work it into the open area. Continue doing this in that circular manner. The reason I'm going in a circular manner is because it's going to get it into all the angles of the stencil, as well as into the fibers. And sometimes you get it a little stronger in places. That's okay. To the right, to the left. Work it back and forth. Keep going back, working into your stenciled area. Pick up more color as necessary, and continue. Now this is where you might want to use one of your Post-it notes. I don't want to stencil those little stars, so I'm just going to cover that area. It's best to cover it than to chance getting into something that you really don't want to. Okay. Work your color to the right, to the left, swish it. What you're doing is getting it into all the corners. So basically, you've stenciled. Voila. Now right over here, in order to repeat that design, you can see that these little stars are going to match up just exactly. You can touch into your color and continue, then you have a continuous border across. This is a very basic kind of repeat. Very simple one to work with. And you can continue working in this manner. Now the reason you need to work that color on the brush, particularly in fabric stenciling, if I went directly to the open area I would have one big dark blob that would be very, very difficult to control. It would stay there, it wouldn't move, it absorbs right into your fibers, so you do need to be a little bit cautious in working from the plastic and working towards the center. So basically, let's call that good. This is really not going to become anything at this point other than it could become a scarf, it could become a piece of a quilt, it could become a lot of different kinds of things, but at this point we're just going to leave it just as we've done it. Then this is basic stenciling. You can enhance that basic stenciling by doing what we're going to call negative stenciling. Remember, I pulled my little star out of my bag of tricks. What I can do is lay that star down, and this is basically the negative. This is what would have come out of my stencil had I cut out a star. And you can stencil around that and see what happens. You're building a background around your stars. Just adds an extra dimension. It's one of those things that's not necessarily a requirement, but it just adds a finishing touch that sometimes makes your work just a little bit more unique and a little bit different from the next person. And I think that that sometimes is what separates people. But see, you can keep, and this is kind of fun because once it starts sticking to your finger, you don't have to work real hard. And just keep moving. And you'll notice that I'm not necessarily going all the way around the star, but I am working the color, bouncing it around. You don't want to have just a straight line of these little stars. But see, we have added to our stenciling on fabric. We're ready to stencil some more fabric. This time we're going to use textures. When you work with textures, you can choose any kind of textured surface that you want to work with. This happens to be the diffuser plate from an overhead lighting source. This is latch hook canvas that I have sprayed the cardboard surface, attached my latch hook canvas, and then sprayed the surface again with the repositional adhesive. This is just plastic canvas. This is an old piece of tatted lace that I have, again, fixed to a piece of cardboard so it's secure. And this is our traditional peeled cardboard. All of these textures, once they have been sprayed with repositional adhesive, are sticky. Once you've decided which texture you're going to use, simply lift your fabric, position the texture under your piece of fabric, then smooth that down nice and snug so there isn't any slippage. Position your stencil over the top, and then one thing that I forgot to mention earlier is the bigger the brush, the quicker the job. So I've chosen a big brush. I'm going to dip into the opened stencil paint cream, work it on the plastic edge of the stencil, and stencil. See what happens? You automatically get the stripes from the cardboard. Work that color, pick up more color, and continue stenciling around your shape. Each time you pick up more color or start working towards the center, always apply that second, third, fourth, fifth, however many coats of color you apply to the outside, and as you work inward, you automatically build your soft highlight. There we have texture of cardboard. We can add another color, and this is a time when I can tell you how you keep your stencil colors from becoming contaminated. Since you are working with an oil-based color, if you don't clean your stencil between color uses, you're going to end up, say if I picked up the yellow and tried to stencil over this black cherry color, I would end up with a very strange color. So you pick up a paper towel. I've laid it on a piece of paper towel, and I'm just going to wipe that stencil off That pulls enough of the color that's been distributed on the stencil off so that I won't fear contamination. You might come up with a pretty color, but that's not necessarily what you had planned. Flip it over and do that same thing to the back side. So now it's ready to change colors. Also, I can change textures. Let me show you what it looks like with the tatted lace. Simply slip that piece of lace under, smooth the color or the fabric down on top, position your stencil. Going back to the same blue color that I used earlier, touch it into the paint cream, work it on the edge of the plastic, and then stencil. See what automatically happens? We get those little decorative touches. This is really, that's an oops. You need to hold your stencil down, or had I taken the time, I could have put the adhesive on the back side. But hold your stencil down, work that color into the open area, and that exposes all of those little flower shapes. Like I was going to say that this is something that's really neat to do if you're stenciling Easter eggs. You can decorate your eggs as you're stenciling them using different colors. You can use the different shapes, and you have decorated Easter eggs just with the application of color. So there we are again. Another stenciled textured heart. You can use all of these different textures that I have shown you, and then you can also do some fun things with adhesive labels, pre-adhesived labels, such as the little gummy stars or the little adhesive heart shapes. Wipe your stencil, and what you're going to do, you can take paper reinforcements, you can take stars, or you can take small price tags, put them on your fabric with your stencil in place, and this is going to become a polka dotted heart, because where the price tags are located will be a very basic kind of reverse stenciling, because when I stencil over, and see I'm putting those so that they extend beyond the outside edge of my stencil. I can stick a heart in there. This is not a heart, this is a star. I can stick a star in there, or two, or better yet, 3. And that's all ready to stencil. I'm going to go ahead and use the same large brush, which brings me to another point. If you're working with brushes in the same color family, since we are working with an oil-based paint, you need to use a brush per color or color family. These two colors that I have selected out here are from the same color family. One is black cherry, one is Christmas red. I can put some baby oil out on a paper towel, like so. Use that as a blotter. Rub my brush in that baby oil, and it's going to clean a good portion of that black cherry paint cream out. And dry it on the paper towel. See, it's not as intense a color as it was when I began, so I can take this brush now and work in the other value of red without fear of changing things drastically. This is going to be a more cherry red than the black cherry was. That enables me to use fewer brushes during the stenciling process. You can't go to the sink and wash a brush because you can't pick up the oil paint if you're working with a wet brush, so you need to have a means by which to clean it back, because oftentimes when you're stenciling, you contaminate your brush by getting it into another color, so you can merely just wipe it on that paper towel and change your color, clean your brush back. Now, talking about changing colors, you can also blend your colors. I picked up a different brush, picked up the yellow, and I'm going to stencil yellow right along on the outside edge. Go back to that initial test point to pick up more color. And when you work this particular way, always be sure that you blend those colors together. That's going to cause that area right along here where the two colors come together to give off a bit of an orange effect, because the yellow and red is going to make orange. So work your colors, blend them in nice and soft, and we have stenciled. Now the fun begins when you start peeling off all these little labels. Okay, we've peeled all of those little shapes off, and we now have a heart that's decorated with stars and polka dots. Simple enough, and a great, great technique also on those Easter eggs. Other abstract shapes can be used. You can decorate squares, you can decorate triangles, all kinds of shapes in the same manner. You can even do leaves, any kind of thing that you want to use using texture. And these extra little shapes, a real fun thing to do is to decorate fish with these kinds of shapes and textures. We're now working with the very same kind of stenciling, a little bit more advanced, we'll say, but very, very accomplishable by the beginner if you follow the rules. Rules, though, are sometimes made to be broken. What we're going to do is, first of all, stencil an apple. I'm going to use this same brush that I picked up yellow with earlier. I've got a little bit of red in it, so I do need to clean it back. Remember the baby oil trick. We're getting a bit of orange on the paper towel. That tells me that it was a good idea that I did clean it up a little bit. Okay, stencil brush is clean. I can start with the apple. Every time I stencil an apple, I always start with yellow. Sunflower yellow is one of my favorite colors. Pick up your color, work it on the plastic, and scrub that color into the open area. This particular technique of stenciling is what I call stacking. The apple itself is part of that technique. Anything can be stacked, but I want to show you how to do it with the apple. And I want to show you some tinting, some shading, some highlighting, the way you change colors. You can see each time I come back and pick up color, now this is just reinforcement, you start at the outside edge and work inward. It gives you your highlights and your shadows. Now, this is not normally what an apple might look like. We can imagine a yellow apple, but what we're going to create is a red apple. In order to make a red apple, you're going to need a device that's necessary to cover up this little stem area. You can see it better if I lift my stencil. See that white area? What I want to do is cover it. I sometimes call this little round shape my round to it. Everybody gets a round to it sometime, so this is what I'm going to use. I also want to tell you while I'm looking at this, this is a stencil palette. I keep forgetting to show you the stencil palette. It's one of Delta's products. It's designed to hold your stencil brushes. You can see how convenient that is. It's also designed to hold your stencil paint cream. So you can put your paint cream and your stencil brush right there to work, and it's especially handy if you're climbing on a ladder, because you can take this, it's very lightweight, you can hold on to it and work, and I keep forgetting to tell you about that. Okay, let's go to the red. Cover your stem area with your little round to it. Work that color on your plastic. A little bit goes a long way. Now this is where we're going to break a rule. Remember I told you that to change colors you need to clean your stencil? Well, we're not going to in this case. It's always fun to be able to break rules and it not really hurt anybody. But notice how the color is changing. Also, we got to hold that stencil. Gotta be sure so that you can see. Keep working that color. I'm holding my round to it. You don't necessarily want to put your highlight direct center of your apple. You can intensify the red on one side and just kind of work that color. So see, my highlight is going to be a little bit off center. Okay, now this is not the way we want it to look when it's all finished. I've removed my round to it. What I want to do is get rid of these real strong, what I'm going to call smile lines. And you can just come back and stencil red across the back of the apple. You may need to pick up a little bit more. Don't ever forget that you've got to keep testing and working that color on the plastic. And see how by working back over that edge and across the back, you're erasing those intense smile lines and intensifying the red of your apple. So we have created an apple. Once the apple's stenciled, it's time to put the stem in place. Just merely slide it over, position the stem in the void area, pick up your next brush, work it into the color, and rub scrub that stem in. So we have a really complete apple at this point. Okay, now I've already wiped this stencil off and I want to show you how you're going to stack items. This is a technique that's used in all the stenciling that I do, or most all of the stenciling I do. When you stencil this way, what you do is you do the front item first. I've already stenciled an item and I'm going to stencil another apple, and the way you do that is to use that treasure, which should have been scrap in some people's minds, to cover the apple that's already been stenciled. This leaves this large open area. Without fear of messing up what's already been stenciled, I can go ahead and stencil another apple. In this case, I'm going to stencil a green apple. Same background color. I just like the yellow glow that's attained when you work with the yellow in the background. Pull that color in. Like I said, the larger the brush, the quicker the job. Okay, I'm going to pick up a brush and touch it into the green. Very, very little bit. I don't know my apple varieties very well, but this might be a Granny Smith. Remember our round to it, because this also needs that deep well around the stem area. And I'm just softly brushing in that green. Pull your round to it away. Finish off the back side to get rid of that intense smile line. Then a nice thing that you can do with these is you can add a little bit of a blush, which would be a tint in some terminology, but it's a blush on an apple. You can put that front and center, or like I'm doing, I'm just pulling it onto this one side. So we now have two apples stenciled. I merely position the stem, pick up my brown brush, and we have two apples with stems. This colander is going to look really great with the apples that I've just stenciled. It's also going to take us into another realm of stenciling. It's going to call us into use of the overlay. This particular stencil requires 3 overlays. It's necessary to go ahead and make your decision and place it so it's kind of up and behind the apples. Remember, we're going to cover the apple with its dropout. That enables us to stencil anything we want to. You can do all kinds of creative things with this kind of stenciling. This is the first. Normally when I stencil, I'm going to be stenciling the largest open areas first, and then you build downward. So each additional part is going to have less stencil area. This will be second, and this will be your final overlay. I've decided to stencil the colander with slate gray. Touch your brush into. Be sure that your cover-up is covering up. And rub scrub that color into the open area. Oftentimes when I'm working along skinny areas such as this stripe where the rim will finally be stenciled in, I use that back and forth manner. Circular manner might pull the stencil out of place. So just kind of circle around where you've got nice stability, but be a little more cautious when you have a long bridge like I'm working with here. Once you have your first color on, then you need to pick up a little stronger color. I've picked up some navy blue, and I'm going to add some shadow to those deeper recesses in the colander, which would be down in the bowl area and along the little corners of that bowl area. You might want to tuck some down along the bottom. And even for some extra strength of shadow, wipe that brush on your paper towel that has baby oil on it. Pick up a touch of black and touch in a little bit of black. That's just going to give you some extra depth. On both outside edges. You could have gotten by with just that initial slate gray color, but I kind of like to add the extra detail of stronger shadows. Now, overlay 1 is ready to move as soon as I mark those registration points. Just touch your disappearing pen to the registration points so that when this is slipped out of place, you've got your markings, and you can quickly come back, line up your registration points, and that tells you exactly where the overlay needs to be. Okay, what we need to do is remember that that apple is still in front of the colander, so you've got to cover up areas that might get messed up if you happen to stencil in the wrong place. Pick up a bit of black, and let's put the holes in. Just work your brush over the holes, to the right, to the left. You want it in all of the angle of those little tiny circles. And we can make the handles black too. I don't think there are a lot of rules about what color colanders should be. Yeah, let's do the little feet that way too. When you're working in really tiny little areas, you don't need to be quite as careful about blending that color on the stencil itself. You can go right to those areas, particularly since I'm using black and want it to be relatively intense here. So be sure and get those little circles stenciled in. I think I've got all of them. Then I'm going to lay that brush aside, pick up my slate gray again, and bring slate gray across the back in that rim. This, like the rim that we dealt with on the first overlay, sometimes when you have a long stretch like this, it's a good idea to go with a back and forth motion. It's just a little more controllable in keeping your stencil in place. Okay, we've already got registration marks marked, so we're ready to move. See how it's taking shape? And the very final step, you almost don't need the registration marks because you know where it has to go, and it should go right in that particular place. Still got my slate blue brush, pick up color, and work that color into the remaining open area of your stencil. Keep a little bit darker to the both outside corners, a little bit of a highlight towards the center, and you have stenciled your colander. I've already marked some wall lines on my wall, and this line is going to hold the top of a garden fence. This little thin brick that was cut earlier is going to be my garden fence. I'm going to be using 3 different colors, and I find that it's easier if you use one color at a time. And also, I have found that as I'm stenciling on walls and using one color, it's sometimes easy just to hold that little container of paint cream and work. Now this feels different than working on fabric. The paint's much slicker. It's not going to absorb into the paint the same way, or the painted wall the same way that it absorbs into the fibers of your fabric. I'm just going to go ahead and put several together. You can just faintly see through the stencil, and I'm just going to keep positioning this stencil. Okay, I'm just going to get up close to the door frame here, and that should do the top of the stencils. Then I'm going to set it in a ways and drop down. Okay, we finished putting in on just a few of the bricks so that you can see what we're doing. I've finished putting in the first color. Now I'm going to reposition that stencil over what's been done, touch into the brick red, and just hit and miss a little bit of darker value. I'm getting a little bit of flakiness. It's not dandruff, it's just part of the stenciling material. It's not going to hurt anything. And just kind of hit that slip-slap manner. What we're doing is creating bricks. We're not creating a piece of velvet. And then of course we'll continue with this color on all of the bricks. The next step is to pick up a touch of white, and that's just going to be a final highlight color. And you'll notice that I'm breaking all kinds of rules. I'm not wiping my stencil. And I oftentimes, when I'm doing this, I don't necessarily even need to touch in with the stencil, because I'm just touching in these little bits of highlight for emphasis rather than for any kind of definite detailing. Okay, now you'll see that I've already put some bricks around this light switch plate, and they are completed. I can continue adding bricks, and that's where I'm going to use the same techniques, the same colors, but I'm going to use the larger brick. You can determine the placement with that very faint visibility through the stencil and work into the same colors. I'll just do a couple and then show you how to go ahead and put in that shadow area. First, put in your brick, or the peach color in a slip-slap manner. Let's see, where do we want to put another one? I guess just above it. We can see that our margin is pretty much equal. Now this would be like a fence that might have some plaster over it and the plaster has come away, so you have bricks exposed and then have places where there would be just plaster visible still. So we've got a couple of the bricks with the peach color. Pick up the barn red. And this again is slip slap, just to get a little bit of another color into your brick. And of course the final step is to add that touch of white. And the white is slip slapped in. In some bricks there might be more, and in some there might be less. Okay, once you have your bricks all laid, then it's time to put in the shadow surrounding it. Cover the brick that you've stenciled. Touch into your bark brown or your darker brown. This is going to recess the mortar around the brick and bring the brick forward. One of the rules of thumb is that dark colors recede and light colors come forward. So what I'm doing is just putting some color around the outside edge of that brick. And I'm just going to go between up to a point, because you don't want any up here. There wouldn't be any shadow out in the sky, but there would be shadow under the brick and to the side. And so that's the way the fence has been built. As you can see, we have worked through the very, very basics of stenciling and worked into some very, very sophisticated kinds of things. It's necessary that you start in the beginning and work to the end, but you can do lots of fun things, terrific things. But this video didn't allow us enough time to give you all of the tips and techniques. So what I have provided for you are some other technique tools. You can use some project books. These are 3 books that were done for Delta by me: Bloom and Fun, Got You Covered, and Man to Man. They're all project oriented to give you more ideas for the use of the art of stenciling. We also have a book that has even more things than was mentioned in this particular video, called Stencil Magic Guide to Stenciling. Again, it's a technique book, but it's full of all kinds of information that would be beneficial to you. Delta provides all kinds of stencils, a nice variety. There are 48 colors in the stencil paint creams, and lots of stencils available. These all can be purchased at your local craft store. Besides the stencils we used on this particular video, there are a wide selection of stencils in my pre-cut catalog. The stencils are sold individually or in pre-designed collections to make it easier for you, the stenciler. The Stencil Artisan League is an organization designed for stencilers. Its home office is in Atlanta, Georgia, and it is a very important organization for you as a beginning stenciler, as well as for those of you who have already begun it as a business. There is a magazine that comes through the organization, and the address of the organization is on the screen now. If you're going to order the catalog, please mention that you viewed the video and that you also were interested in the apple. If you do that, I'll be happy to send the apple to you for free.